Good evening. It is March 17th, 2019. It is St. Patrick's Day as well. And I'm very tired. But what else is new? Let's see what's on the front page of Wikipedia today. Today's featured article is John C. Calhoun, a senator from South Carolina, who is also the 7th Vice President of the United States, under Presidents both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. In the news today, flash floods and winds caused by Cyclone Idai kill more than 250 people in Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Let's see. On this day, considered March 18th, according to Wikipedia, in 1793, during the War of the First Coalition, Habsburg Austrians, together with Dutch Republic troops, repulsed a series of French assaults after bitter fighting in Neerwinden, present-day Belgium. Let's see. Today here, I was thinking... hello, Tyler. Thank you for coming on the stream. And hello, Kagan. Thank you for coming on the stream, even though you're very disappointed. As I said, I'm very tired. I wasn't even sure if I was going to stream tonight, not only because I had a family thing, but also just because in general I've been kind of out of it lately. But what else is new? I do, however, want to read something just a little bit. Because in school I have an assignment due where I have to talk about a topic of my choosing for about 6 to 8 minutes. And it has to be 6 to 8 minutes. If I run over, I get points deducted, and if I run under, I get points deducted. Obviously, I'm very good at talking. I do it all the time. However, it's difficult for me to find a topic that I like that I can talk for only 6 minutes about. So I thought that I might also, or that I thought a lot about what I might say for this class, what the talk might be about. I'm thinking that I want to talk about the streetlight effect, because the streetlight effect is a psychological phenomenon. It's also known as drunkard search principle, which unfortunately isn't as cool as it sounds, but it does sound cool. It's a type of observational bias that occurs when people only search for something where it is easiest to look. It refers to a joke wherein a policeman sees a drunk man searching for something under a street light and asks what the drunk has lost. The drunk says he lost his keys, and so they both look under the streetlight together. After a few minutes, the policeman asks the drunk if he is sure that he lost the keys there, and the drunk replies, no, actually, he lost them in the park. The policeman asks why he is searching there, and the drunk replies, because this is where the light is. It has been used metaphorically in the social sciences since 1964, when Abraham Kaplan referred to it as the principle of the drunkard search. the idea is that rather than doing something useful, we'll do something easy. And lately I've been complaining a lot. Kagan has heard plenty of this, but I've been complaining a lot that people are perhaps a little flaky, or that um, they only do the things which are easy, even if it doesn't always make sense. And this plays into that, where people will only search where, or will only do the things that they want to rather than the things they should. And I won't go into too much detail in my personal life because this show is boring enough as it is without that. But needless to say, as of late, I've been thinking about people and how lazy they are. And, well, I suppose it's good timing because I actually, even though some things in my life have been going on that make me think of this thing, streetlight effect and whatnot, I've been thinking that I would use this as my topic for this talk for a while. Still trying to decide. I need to decide quickly though, because if I have a week off, thankfully for spring break, but the week after this, I will be back in school, and if I don't have to give my speech that week, I will have to give it the next week for sure. And part of my mental exhaustion, I think, is just feeling overwhelmed with, well, for one thing, those personal things that have been going on, and secondly is all the homework that I think about, because I do have a lot to do, and thankfully I can do a lot of it on spring break and maybe catch up with some of it. But for the most part, it's also well, it's a little overwhelming, and I almost hate to admit that because I feel like you shouldn't be overwhelmed by abstracts or whatever, and perhaps that's what people call toxic masculinity, where it's this idea that a man shouldn't be affected by emotions or anything like that. But I'm human and I'm exhausted. And it's funny because yesterday I didn't even work, but um, despite that, I took the day off and I still kind of got home and still felt kind of exhausted and mentally running on fumes, as it were. And I still feel that way. Obviously, I'm okay, but it's interfering with my ability to talk and think. And I wasn't even sure if I was going to stream tonight. I'm here now, though, and we'll see how that goes. Let's see. Tyler is telling me to talk about the plot to Metal Gear. Which, I mean, I guess I could do that. Let's see. What else did I talk about last time? I don't even remember. I can't even remember what I did yesterday, let alone last week. Let's see here. No, that's not it. I organized because I have a little TXT file that I refer back to so I can remember what I have talked about and what I want to talk about. And ironically, because last week I sorted it to try and make things a little easier, now it's a little harder because I haven't been adjusted to how I improved it and sorted it out. So last time we read one of my short stories. We read about Dune a little bit, the Frank Herbert novel, and we talked a little bit about the history of genre fiction, particularly in science fiction, with regards to its authors, Frank Herbert being one. But we also talked about Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, who are considered some of the biggest contributors to the genre. And then we talked about religious philosophy a little bit, which was very much impromptu, very spontaneous. I was not expecting that, but I ended up settling on that, and it ended up being, well, I think interesting. Tyler was the only one that reacted to it, but he seemed to like it. Let's see. I had thought about taking a look at some other things. I had the brilliant idea to try and look up bad self-published books because there are plenty of those, and I don't know if I would read the whole thing, but I could take a look at some of the reviews people have written and maybe have a laugh over them. But I also wonder if maybe that would end up being like what happened with the fan fiction, how we were trying to find some interesting bad fan fiction and didn't end up finding any that was particularly awful. So we ended up just being bored. Apparently, I also have a list of short stories on my Instagram that someone posted and I saved, and I thought about maybe going over those and seeing how they're doing. I think I might save those for a night when I'm a little closer to 100%, because as you can, as I've said, and as you can probably tell, I'm really stumbling over myself here. So I might, because those are supposed to be genuinely good, so I would hate for those to waste those on a bad night like this. I had also thought about maybe looking up some riddles and trying to decipher those. I don't know how I got that idea, probably from The Hobbit. So I don't know if anyone in the chat currently cares, but I know Tyler had mentioned talking about the plot to Metal Gear, which is a whole mess in and of itself. Now he's saying riddles. I don't know if Kagan is paying enough attention, but if he does, if he is, uh, maybe he could say something in chat, and if not, I will slap him because I actually know him in real life. He is very tall, though. I would have to get a ladder and slap him. You know what? One vote is good enough. Let's look up some riddles. Riddle me this, Batman. Let's look up so J.R.R. Tolkien, who we've talked about quite a few times on this stream. He wrote The Lord of the Rings, obviously, but The Lord of the Rings was a sequel to a book he wrote called The Hobbit. The interesting thing, or perhaps I think it's interesting, is that The Hobbit came first, which is funny because that's not, that's not as well regarded as The Lord of the Rings, or at least not as influential. And how J.R.R. Tolkien came to write the Hobbit was that he he had created Middle Earth and all the lore and the world building and all that, and he mostly did it for his own amusement, just something to keep himself busy. And what I had heard, I think it's on the bonus features of the Lord of the Rings movie, where they talk about the history of Tolkien and how he came up with Middle Earth and all that. He had talked about, or rather, they had talked about that he started first by making up his own language. He didn't write any characters, he didn't write any settings. He wrote a language first. I believe the term is that he was a philologist, which means that he kind of had an appreciation for language and language structure. And so he came up with this kind of language just to keep himself amused, and came up with its lettering and all that sort of thing. Because he had a really great font and lettering for it, which he refers to as Elvish. But anyways, before it was Elvish, he wrote out the language, and he decided, that it was essentially like a fairy language, like coming up with a story, except it didn't have a plot, it was just a language. But then he decided, well, what sort of people use this language? What do they look like? What do they do? And so he worked backwards from that language to establish the elves. And there's more than one type of Elvish. I don't know all of them because I'm no Tolkien expert, but he came up with quite a few, and a lot of them were good and wholesome or bright languages, but some of them were dark, like the language that is actually on the One Ring. That one is considered an evil language. And from there, Tolkien started to write what we now know as the Silmarillion and all the lore and histories of Middle Earth. And he wrote this extensive history and all this stuff. And again, it wasn't anything he intended to share. It was just something he sort of did for his own amusement. And he had a lot of time devoted to it, and he spent years doing it. And obviously he enjoyed it a lot because that was sort of how he kind of That was his hobby and how he expressed himself. And he didn't do it to worry about scrutiny because he wasn't publishing it. He didn't he didn't really have much consideration beyond what he himself wanted. And it's an extensive history. It's incredible how much detail there is, and it's so thorough because Tolkien wasn't intending to write any particular story. He would just write a story and then work backwards from there, or work forwards from there. And the Lord of the Rings itself takes place in the Third Age. That wasn't something Tolkien decided to be cool. That was something that he just automatically settled on because he had already written the first two ages. Now, the thing is that he had the elves, which were based on Norse mythology. They have, and Tolkien himself loved mythology and legends and all this sort of thing, and he wrote extensively about them and taught on them, if I'm not mistaken. But he loved folklore and legends, and so he sort of built his own mythos and folklore just for fun. And he had, the elves, obviously, but then there were also the dwarves and excuse me. There were also the Maiar, which are sort of the angels, or the sort of the theology of the world concerning its creation and its deities and all that. Tolkien, of course, was a devout Catholic, so there was some influence there, but he said that it wasn't intentional, at least not at first, that it was something that he sort of realized in retrospect that he could add on to. And so he built on all these ideas, and he had this complex mythology, not only about elves, but dwarves and humans and their cultures and their histories and how they interplay with each other. But one day, the story goes that he was grading papers for his class because he was a teacher, a professor, and he just had this sort of prompting, this sort of random prompting, and it was the words, I think it was, "In a hole on a hill there lived a hobbit." And he wrote it down, not really thinking much about it. And then he went back over it and he liked it, this little phrase, and he just thought, well, what the heck is a hobbit? He didn't know. He didn't have any idea for it. So he decided to come up with something, and he came up with the hobbits. And the explanation, I believe, for that in his world was that the hobbits were such a laid back and peaceful people that didn't interact with the outside world, that so much so that nobody even knew they existed until the end of the Second Age. So he wrote all this stuff, and then somewhere along the lines he had the inspiration for a book called The Hobbit, where he was writing on it, or he decided to write on it and expound on it and kind of explore it using this writing. And he used characters he already had, like Gandalf the Grey, and he used the dwarves, a culture he already established, in the elves, and he ended up writing The Hobbit. And in The Hobbit, there's a little section, because Tolkien integrated a lot of his established lore, which obviously hadn't been published. It was just something he had on hand to use whenever he wanted. And so he decided to include as much of it as he could because he enjoyed that lore and he enjoyed sharing it and integrating it and all that sort of thing. And sorry, I'm just trying to answer a text here. And one of the items of lore that he included was a creature called Gollum and a chapter called Riddles in the Dark. And so he included Gollum and this strange little creature, and whom the main character, the Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, encounters. And he had, a little bit of a backstory for Gollum, who had acquired this mystical ring years and years ago, and was deformed into this strange creature because of its magic. And he, the Hobbit itself doesn't expound too much on this particular instance, but Tolkien knew there was a story there. So when he published The Hobbit and it was fairly successful, he went back to that scene and he's like, well, I think I might actually want to explain this because this is something that I like and this is something that I feel deserves its own attention. And and so he went back and he decided to write about this ring called the Lord of the Rings because it was one ring to rule them all, greater than all these other rings and whatnot and what have you. We all know the story, and if we don't, we really need to. Well, I can't help you if you don't know what the One Ring is because, frankly, at this point, it's practically ubiquitous. But anyways, so you think of the Lord of the Rings, and a lot of people, when they think of writers and authors, they sort of think that a writer just sits down one day and decides to make a masterpiece. That Tolkien just decided to write this grand scheme, this incredible little bit of lore and mythos. And people just assume that that was his intention from the beginning. But more or less what it was Tolkien improvising and doing something that he loved, which is coming up with this lore and this story and explaining it and expounding on it. And again, this wasn't there was no precedent for this. In fact, Tolkien was trying to break the precedent. He and C.S. Lewis were writing their books at the same time, and they both loved mythology and all this, all these other things. And the story goes that they both decided that even though they loved fantasy and folklore, that it wasn't being well represented, and that the modern fantasy stories were all schlock, that they were all terrible and weren't worthy of weren't really noteworthy in any way. Excuse me. So what ends up happening is they decide that they're going to write their own little bits of folklore and to defy that schlock of fantasy, which at the time was very, I guess you'd call it the literature equivalent of a B movie, where it wasn't about anything good. It was just about things that were entertaining. And Tolkien really broke this precedent, in particular with The Lord of the Rings, where he starts off the story with a birthday party of all things. That's not that was not typical of the genre, and it still isn't, I don't think. And of course, C.S. Lewis kind of did something similar, where it's not about this grand scope. It's more just about these kids that are playing, and then they enter into this mystical world of Narnia. And so Tolkien didn't set out necessarily to make a point. He just set out to do something that he loved. And what he loved was coming up with languages and mythology. And when he came up with it, a lot of people criticized The Lord of the Rings. Usually people that weren't familiar with Tolkien. They criticized him as being overly idealistic, that he just was naive, that he had no knowledge of the harshness of the world, or that he was overly optimistic. Perhaps not realizing that he was a veteran not only of World War One, but the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the most devastating battles in recent history. And Tolkien had seen a lot of his friends die in that battle, and he was well aware of the strife and the toil of the real world. He wasn't a stranger to it, but he was an optimist ultimately. And the thing is, when you read The Lord of the Rings, even though the movies might portray everything as being idealistic, particularly when it comes to the elves, actually reading The Lord of the Rings, there are things in there that are not ideal necessarily. It's been a little while since I've read it, so I might stumble over this as I do most things, but there's a little bit in the Fellowship of the Ring where they talk about how the Age of Heroes is coming to its end, and how all those stories of heroism are coming to its end, and corruption is rampant. So much so that the elves, a lot of their so-called eternal structures, like some of their trees and their homes, those are starting to rot and wither away. And so now that the elves don't have a choice, they have to essentially leave their home, and they head for the Grey Havens. So even in the first book, which is the lightest of the three books, like you can see, it's not just, oh, sunshine and flowers and, after school special, don't do drugs. There's some actual moral depth to it beyond just, oh, things are good or things are bad. There is this tragedy and this sense of longing and this yearning for something better, and this desire for a more peaceful time, which you don't always get. And certainly when you look at the Silmarillion, which I unfortunately haven't read either, but there's a lot of that in there as well, where there's a lot of like civil war between the elves and a lot of fights between the elves, and a lot of the corruption stems from elves, or the Maiar, who are basically supposed to be the angels of the world, these protector spirits who are corrupted into evil. For instance, the Balrog from The Lord of the Rings, Durin's Bane, he was Maiar, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe that was just a fan theory. Point is that Tolkien was no stranger to tragedy, and I think it's also significant as a writer that Tolkien wasn't setting out necessarily to impress anyone. He was just writing something that he loved. And a lot of times, and the reason that I talk about particularly this instance of Tolkien was that it wasn't just a matter of him being idealistic, but it was a matter of him following through on consequences. And because there is a long and bloodied history to the Middle Earth. And how Tolkien ended up with the Lord of the Rings in general was that he followed through with his ideas. He didn't just put a character in, and he didn't just say, oh, I want this to happen. He says, well, here's the situation. Okay, what happens now? He has these characters. He decided that he was going to have a hobbit, and then he was going to have this hobbit go on an adventure. And in that adventure, he included a little bit of the lore in the past, a little hint of the Ring of Power. And then in retrospect, he decided to go back to that. And because he followed through on his ideas, and because he actually developed them, not because he wanted money or fame or to prove a point, but just because he enjoyed creating this history and following through with it, that was what led to his magnum opus. And that's significant to me as a writer, because people, I think, both writers and even, or non-writers and even writers, tend to think of writing just as like a checklist or sort of a tyranny of will, where you just say, well, I think, I'm going to write this story and I'm going to sit down and write The Lord of the Rings. And that's not what happened. The reason why The Lord of the Rings is so good isn't because Tolkien decided it would be good. It was because Tolkien put his heart into it, because he followed through and puts this human element, for lack of a better word, because these characters are relatable, and they are set forth, and they have their own moral weights and consequences, and they follow through in certain ways. And you don't always get that with writers. They don't always do that. And I think that's the big difference, is that Tolkien didn't start with a checklist. A lot of people, especially when they write fantasy, they have that sort of checklist. They'll be like, well, I'm going to write a fantasy story. Well, what does fantasy have? It has magic and swords and dragons and elves and dwarves. When in reality, Tolkien himself didn't do that. He didn't say, well, it needs to have dragons. It needs to have magic. He's just like, what makes sense? What makes sense for this world? Where is it going to go? And that's the key difference. Thanks for tuning in, Kimmery. Nice to have you back this week. It looks like we've actually got quite a few people here, more than I was expecting. Welcome to the stream. You can introduce yourself in the chat if you're not shy. If you are shy, feel free to like and subscribe. I stream every week. I promise I am actually going to get to those Riddles in the Dark. Hello, Shelby. Thank you for coming in. Um, but anyways, as I was saying, the whole point and the thing that separates Tolkien, I don't think it was necessarily the fact that he came up with his own language and his own history. I think it was just the fact that that was what he loved. And when you do what you love, it really shines through your work. And that's significant. So for me as a writer, I don't look at a story and I don't say I'm going to write something great. I say, okay, what's happening and how do I follow through with it? And so far, at least with the book that I've been trying to write, I feel like that's been better than anything else. That like if I try and dictate a story, that it doesn't work. But if I let the story take its own helm and follow through with itself, then it tends to be better. At least that's how I see it so far. But anyways, that's enough rambling about Tolkien. I guess if there's any point to take away from this is that the great big scope of the Lord of the Rings, which is without a doubt the single most influential piece of genre fiction to ever exist, it all has its roots in Riddles in the Dark from The Hobbit, which is just a little chapter between Bilbo Baggins and Gollum, the weird thing that lives in the cave, going back and forth and trying to outsmart each other with riddles. Maybe I was gonna just read the riddles themselves, but maybe I can read the whole chapter. I think that might be okay. Also, for the record, I have not actually seen the Hobbit movie, and I actually have not read through the entirety of the Hobbit. So, let's see if I can find it. I don't know if I can, honestly. Oh, now this is kind of interesting. So there's a website online called genius.com, which is it's a website for lyrics. I'm just trying my hardest to ignore Kim Marie's jokes. But it's genius.com is a website for lyrics, but looking at it, it actually seems like there's the entire chapter from The Hobbit, Riddles in the Dark, on this website. I think I'm just going to read that whole chapter. I don't think that's a problem if I do. And if you don't like it, send me like a cease and desist. I don't even care. Okay, chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours. On all fours. Till he touched the wall of the tunnel. But neither up nor down could he find anything. Nothing at all. No signs of goblins, no sign of dwarfs. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going in when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could, and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand met with what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal laying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness. For a long while, gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other, but that only made him miserabler. Is miserabler a word? I don't know. He could not think what to do, nor could he think what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was he had been laying quiet, out of sight and out of mind, in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. Then he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him, as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought on him out of the dark holes of that place. Still at the moment he felt very crushed. But in slapping all his pockets and feeling all round for matches, his hand came on the hilt of his little sword, the little dagger he got from the trolls that he had quite forgotten. Nor did the goblins seem to have noticed it, as he wore it inside his breeches. Now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade, he thought, and goblins are not very near, and yet not far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the goblin wars of which so many songs had sung, and also he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on goblins that came upon him suddenly. Go back, he thought. No good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward. The only thing to do. On we go. So up he got, and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, and one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all of a patter and a pitter. Now certainly Bilbo was in what is called a tight place, but you must remember it was not quite so tight for him as it would be for me or you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people, and after all, if their holes are nice cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of the goblins, still they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have been recovered from bumping. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily, and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, and they have a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins' place all the same. The tunnels seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was still going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist and a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow, and over to the days beyond. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into water. Ugh! It was icy cold. That pulled him up sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path, or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passages, or the brink of a deep, dark subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, when he listened hard, drops drip, drip, dripping from an unseen roof into the water below, but there seemed to be no other sort of sound. So it is a pool or a lake, not even an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim, and he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things, with big, bulging, blind eyes wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains, fish whose fathers swam in, goodness only knows how many years ago, and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there are other things more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back in their beginnings to ages before the goblins, who only widened them and joined them up with passages, and the original owners are still there in odd comers, slinking and nosing about. Deep down here by the dark water lived old Gollum, a small, slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. Again, this isn't necessarily true. Perhaps at the time Tolkien didn't know who Gollum was, but he came up with something like that. But that only happened because he followed through with his storytelling, as I had mentioned earlier. So it's important for an author not only to come up with ideas, but to try and explain them, because that's what makes the world more interesting. And that might seem like an obvious thing, but it really isn't. A lot of authors, as we kind of mentioned with the streetlight effect, they tend to only do things where it's easiest. Magic especially is particularly bad for this, where authors will come up with some magical explanation and then just leave it at that, which makes the world that they are building or trying to build that much flatter. Anyways, so it's important to follow through on these things, and if you do, you may not be Tolkien, but the difference between what you do next and what you do now might be the difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, depending on what you expound on and what you don't expound on. Anyways, I don't know where he came from, nor who he was or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two big round pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he rowed about quite quietly on the lake, for a lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled it with large feet dangling over the side, but never a ripple did he make, not he. He was looking out of his pale lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as thinking. He liked meat, too. Goblin he thought good, when he could get it, but he took care that they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind, if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water, while he was prowling about. They very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. They had come on the lake when they when they were tunneling down long ago, and they found they could go no further. So there their road ended in that direction, and there was no reason to go that way unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. Actually, Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether flummoxed and at the end of his way and his wits. Suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed, "Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast, at least a tasty morsel it'd make us, Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and he suddenly saw the two pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him. "What is he, precious?" whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself through never having anyone else to speak to. This is what he had come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment, only curious. Otherwise he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. "I am Bilbo Baggins. I have lost the dwarves, and I have lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am. And I don't want to know, if only I can get away." "What's he got in his hands?" said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. A sword, a blade which came out of Gondolin," said Gollum, and became quite polite. "P'raps he sits here and chats with it a bit, my precious. It likes riddles, p'raps it does it?" He was anxious to appear friendly, at any rate for the moment, and until he found out more about the sword and the hobbit, whether he was quite alone really, whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum really was hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them, and sometimes guessing them, had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago, before he lost all his friends and was driven away, alone, and crept down into the dark under the mountains. "Very well," said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree, until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, whether he was fierce or hungry, and whether he was a friend of the goblins. "You ask first," because he had not the time to think of a riddle. So Gollum hissed, "What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows." "Huh, easy," Bilbo said. "Mountain, I suppose." "Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, my precious." "If precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us and we don't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We shows it the way out, yes?" "All right," said Bilbo, not daring to disagree, and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. Uh, 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating that was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do. Chestnuts, chestnuts, he whispered. Teeth, teeth, my precious, but we only has 6. Excuse me. Then he asked his second. Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters. Half a moment, cried Bilbo, who was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. Wind, wind, of course, he said, and he was so pleased that he made one up on the spot. This'll puzzle the nasty little underground creature, he thought. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. Sir, sir, said Gollum. He had been underground a long, long time, and was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought him memories of ages and ages and ages before, where he lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by a river. This is my precious, he said. Sun on the daisy, it means. It does. But these ordinary, above-ground, everyday sorts of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry, so this time he tried something a bit more difficult and more unpleasant. It cannot be seen, it cannot be felt, cannot be heard, it cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes fill it. And empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter. Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard this sort of thing before, and the answer was all round him anyway. Dark, he said without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. A box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. He asked to gain time, until he could think of a really hard one. This, he thought, was a dreadfully easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual words. But it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and spluttered. After some while, Bilbo became impatient. Well, what is it? He said. The answer's not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise you are making. Give us a chance. Let it give us a chance, my precious. Well, Bilbo said, after giving him a long chance, what about your guess? But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago, and sitting under the river bank teaching his grandmother Oh, Tolkien, teaching his grandmother to suck. Eggs, he whispered. Eggs it is, then he asked. Alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. He also, in his turn, thought it was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer, but he could not remember anything better at the moment, he was so flustered by the egg question. All the same, it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it as easy as winking, since you are sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking. Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself. Is it nice, precious? Is it juicy? Is it scrumptiously crunchable? He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. Half a moment, said the hobbit, shivering. I gave you a good long chance just now. It must make haste. Haste, said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat and onto the shore to get at Bilbo. But when he put his long, webby foot in the water, a fish jumped out in fright and landed on Bilbo's toes. Ugh, he said, it is cold and clammy. And so he guessed. Fish! Fish! He cried. It's a fish! Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as he ever could be, so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. No legs lay on one leg, 2 legs sat near on 3 legs, 4 legs got some. It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it, if he had asked it at another time. As it was, talking of fish, no legs was not so very difficult, and after that the rest was easy. Fish on a little table, man at table sitting on a stool, the cat has the bones. That, of course, is the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible. This is what he said. This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, and flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Poor Bilbo sat in the dark thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever told of in tales, but not one of them had done all of these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different and that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time! Give me time!" But all that came out was a sudden squeal, was, "Time! Time!" Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry, and also tired of the game, and it made him very hungry indeed. This time he did not go back to the boat. He sat down in the dark by Bilbo. That made the hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits. "It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes, yes. Just one more question to guess. Yes, yes," said Gollum. But Bilbo simply could not think of any question with that nasty, wet, cold thing sitting next to him and pawing and poking him. He scratched himself. He pinched himself. Still he could not think of anything. "Ask us," Gollum asked. "Ask us." Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself. He gripped on his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand. There he found the ring he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said out loud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and he was frightfully upset. "Not fair! Not fair!" he hissed. "It isn't fair, my precious, is it, to ask us what's it got in its nasty little pockets?" Jeez, this wreaks havoc on my voice. I'm going to start Golluming here in a second. Bilbo, seeing what had happened and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said louder. Hissed Gollum. "It must give us 3 guesses, my precious, 3 guesses." "Very well, guess away." "Hanses," said Gollum. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had luckily just taken his hand out again. "Guess again." Gollum was more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he had kept in his own pockets. Fish bones, goblins' teeth, wet shells, a bit of bat wing, a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think what other people kept in their pockets. "Knife," he said at last. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had lost his some time ago. "Last guess." Now Gollum was in a much worse state than when Bilbo had asked him the egg question. He hissed and spluttered and rocked himself backwards and forwards, and slapped his feet on the floor, and wriggled and squirmed, but still he did not dare to waste his last guess. "Come on," said Bilbo. "I am waiting." He tried to sound bold and cheerful, but he did not feel at all sure how the game was going to end, whether Gollum guessed right or not. "Time's up," he said. "String or nothing," shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair working in 2 guesses at once. "Both wrong," cried Bilbo, very much relieved, and he jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall, and held out his little sword. He knew, of course, that the riddle game was sacred and of immense antiquity, and even wicked creatures were afraid to cheat when they played at it, but he felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise at a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slide out of it. After a while, that last question had not been a genuine after all, that last question had not been a genuine riddle according to the ancient laws. But at any rate, Gollum did not at once attack him. He could see the sword in Bilbo's hand. He sat still, shivering and whispering. At last Bilbo could wait no longer. "Well," he said, "what about your promise? I want to go. You must show me the way." "Did we say so, precious? Show the nasty little baggins the way out, yes, yes. But what has it got in its pockets, eh? Not string, precious, but not nothing. Oh, no, calm." "Never you mind," said Bilbo. "A promise is a promise." "Cross it is, impatient precious," hissed Gollum. "But it must wait. Yes, it must. We can't go up the tunnel so hasty. We must go and get some things first. Yes, things to help us. Well, hurry up, said Bilbo, relieved to think of Gollum going away. He thought he was just making an excuse and did not mean to come back. What was Gollum talking about? What useful thing could he keep out on the dark lake? But he was wrong. Gollum did mean to come back. He was angry. He was angry now, and hungry. And he was a miserable, wicked creature, and he already had a plan. Not far away was his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, and there in his hiding place he kept a few wretched oddments, and one very beautiful thing. Very beautiful, very wonderful. He had a ring, a golden ring, a precious ring. My birthday present, he whispered to himself, as he often had in the endless dark days. That's what we wants now. Yes, we wants it. He wanted it because it was a ring of power, and if you could slip that ring on your finger, you were invisible. Only in full sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow, and that would be shaky and faint. My birthday present! It came to me on my birthday, my precious! And so he always had to say to himself. But who knows how Gollum came by that present ages ago in the old days when such rings were still at large in the world? Perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Gollum used to wear it at first, till it tired him. Then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin, till it galled him. Now usually he hid it in a hole in the rock on his island, and was always going back to look at it, and still sometimes he put it on, when he could not bear to be parted from it any longer, and when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish. Then he would creep along dark passages, looking for stray goblins. He might even venture into places where the torches were lit, and made his eyes blink and smart, for he would be safe. Oh yes, quite safe. No one would see him, no one would notice him, till he had his fingers on their throat. Only a few hours ago he had worn it, and caught a small goblin imp. How it squeaked! He still had a bone or two left to gnaw, but he wanted something softer. Quite safe. Yes, he whispered to himself. It won't see us, will it, my precious? No, it won't see us, and its nasty little sword will be useless. Yes, quite. Jeez Louise. Respect to Andy Serkis, who was able to bring this character to life so thoroughly, and without wrecking his vocal cords for good. Anyways, going on. That is what was in his wicked little mind, as he slipped suddenly from Bilbo's side, and flapped back to his boat, and went off into the dark. Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him. Still he waited for a while, for he had no idea how to find his way out alone. Suddenly he heard a screech. It sent a shiver down his back. Gollum was cursing and wailing away in the gloom, not very far off by the sound of it. Dangnabbit. Sorry. He was on his island, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain. Where is it? Where is it? Bilbo heard him crying. Lost it is, my precious. Lost! Lost! Curse us and crush us, my precious is lost. What's the matter? Bilbo called. What have you lost? You mustn't ask us, shrieked Gollum. Not its business. No, Gollum, it's lost. Gollum, Gollum, Gollum. Well, so am I, cried Bilbo, and I want to get on Lost, and I won the game, and you promised. So come along, come and let me out, and then go on with your looking. Utterly miserable as Gollum sounded, Bilbo could not find much pity in his heart, and he had a feeling that anything Gollum wanted so much could hardly be something good. Come along, he shouted. No, not yet, precious, Gollum answered. We must search for it. It's lost, Gollum. But you never guessed my last question, and you promised, said Bilbo. Never guessed, said Gollum. Then suddenly out of the gloom came to a sharp hiss. What has it got in its pockets? Tell us that. It must tell first. As far as Bilbo knew, there was no particular reason why he should not tell. Gollum's mind had jumped to a guess quicker than his. Naturally, for Gollum had brooded for ages on this one thing, and he was always afraid of its being stolen. But Bilbo was annoyed at the delay. After all, he had won the game, pretty fairly, at a horrible risk. Answers were to be guessed, not given, he said. But it wasn't a fair question. Not a riddle, precious. No. Oh, well, if it's a matter of ordinary questions, then I asked one first. What have you lost? Tell me that. What has it got in its pockets? The sound came hissing louder and sharper, and as he looked towards it, to his alarm, Bilbo now saw two small points of light peering at him. Suspicion grew in Gollum's mind. The light of his eyes burned with a pale flame. What have you lost? Bilbo persisted, but now the light in Gollum's eyes had become a green fire, and it was coming swiftly nearer. Gollum was in his boat again, paddling wildly back to the dark shore, and such a rage of lust and suspicion was in his heart that no sword had any more terror for him. Bilbo could not guess what had maddened the wretched creature, but he saw that all was up, and that Gollum was meant to murder him at any rate. Just in time he turned and ran blindly back up the dark passage down which he had come, keeping close to the wall and feeling it with his left hand. What has it got in his pockets? He heard the hiss loud behind him, and the splash as Gollum leapt from his boat. What have I wonder? He said to himself as he panted and stumbled along. He put his left hand in his pocket. The ring felt very cold as it quietly slipped onto his groping forefinger. The hiss was close behind him. He turned now and saw Gollum's eyes like small green lamps coming up the slope. Terrified, he tried to run faster, but suddenly he struck his toes on a snag in the floor and fell flat with his sword under him. In a moment Gollum was on him, but before Bilbo could do anything, recover his breath, pick himself up, or wave his sword, Gollum passed by, taking no notice of him, cursing and whispering as he ran. What could it mean? Gollum could see in the dark. Bilbo could see the light of his eyes palely shining even from behind. Painfully he got up and sheathed his sword, which was now glowing faintly again. Then very cautiously he followed. There seemed nothing else to do. It was no good crawling back down to Gollum's water. Perhaps if he followed him, Gollum might lead him to some way of escape without meaning to. Curse it! Curse it! Curse it! Hissed Gollum. Curse the Baggins! It's gone! What has it got in its pockets? Oh, we guess, my precious. He's found it. Yes, he must have. My birthday present. Bilbo pricked up his ears. He was at last beginning to guess himself. He hurried a little, getting as close as he dared behind Gollum, who was still going quickly, not looking back, but turning his head from side to side, as Bilbo could see from the side of from the faint glimmer on the walls. My birthday present! Curse it! How did we lose it, my precious? Yes, that's it. When we came this way last, when we tested that nasty young squeaker, that's it. Cursed it! Curse it! It slipped from us after all these ages and ages. It's gone! Gollum! Hey, Smoothskin, want a drink? Ugh. Suddenly Gollum sat down and began to weep, a whistling and gurgling sound horrible to listen to. Bilbo halted and flattened himself against the tunnel wall. After a while, Gollum stopped weeping and began to talk. He seemed to be having an argument with himself. It's no good going back there to search. No, we doesn't remember all the places we visited. And it's no use. The Baggins has got it in his pockets. The nasty noser has found it, we says. We guesses, precious, only guesses. We can't know till we find the nasty creature and squeezes it. But it doesn't know what the present can do, does it? It'll just keep it in its pockets. It doesn't know, and it can't go far. It's lost itself, the nasty nosy little thing. It doesn't know the way out. It said so. It said so, yes, but it's tricksy. It doesn't say what it means. It won't say what it's got in its pockets is. It knows a way in. It must know a way out, yes. It's off to the back door. To the back door, that's it. The goblins will catch it then. It can't get out that way, precious. Gollum. Yes, goblins but if it's got the present, our precious present, then the goblins will get it. The goblins will get it. Gollum. They'll find it. They'll find out what it does. We shan't ever be safe again. Never. Gollum. One of the goblins will put it on, and then no one will see him. He'll be there, but not seen. Not even our clever eyes will notice him, and he'll come creepsy and tricksy and catch us. Gollum. Then let's stop talking, precious, and make haste. If the Baggins has gone that way, we must go quick and see. Go, not far now. Make haste. With a spring, Gollum got up and started shambling off at a great pace. Bilbo hurried after him, still cautiously, though his chief fear now was tripping on another snag and falling with a noise. His head was in a whirl of hope and wonder. It seemed that the ring he had was a magic ring. It made you invisible. He had heard of such things, of course, in old tales, but it was hard to believe that he had really found one, by accident. Still, there it was. Gollum with his bright eyes had passed him by, only a yard to one side. On they went, Gollum flip-flapping ahead, hissing and cursing, Bilbo going behind as softly as a hobbit can. Soon they came to places where, as Bilbo had noticed on the way down, side passages opened, this way and that. Gollum began to at once count them. 1 left, yes. 1 right, yes. 2 right, yes, yes. 2 left, yes, yes. And so on. And so on and on. As the count grew, he slowed down, and he began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind, and he was getting afraid. Goblins might be about, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left as they went up. 7 right, yes. 6 left, yes, he whispered. This is it. This is the way to the back door. Yes, here's the passage. He peered in and shrank back. But we mustn't go in, precious. No, we dursn't. Goblins is down there. Lots of goblins is. We smells them. What shall we do? Curse them and crush them. Curse them and crush them. We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see. So they came to a dead stop. Gollum had brought Bilbo to the way out after all, but Bilbo could not get in. There was Gollum sitting humped up right in the opening, and his eyes gleamed cold in his head as he swayed it from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse, but Gollum stiffened at once, and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed soft but menacingly. He could not see the hobbit, but now he was on the alert, and he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened. Hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right down with his flat hands splayed on the floor, and his head thrust out, nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring, gathered for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing, and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away, out of that horrible darkness, while he had strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or try to yet, and he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror, welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless unmarked days without light or hope of betterment. Hard stone, goldfish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then quite suddenly in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he leaped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air. Indeed, had he known it, he only just missed cracking his skull on the low arch of the passage. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed it as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. His hand snapped it on thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair on his sturdy feet, sped off down the new tunnel. He did not turn to see what Gollum was doing. There was hissing and cursing almost at his heels at first, then it stopped. All at once there came a blood-curdling shriek, filled with hatred and despair. Gollum was defeated. He dared go no further. He had lost his prey, and lost, too, the only thing he had ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart to his mouth, but still he held on, now faint as an echo, but menacing. The voice came behind. Thief! 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 Baggins! We hates it! We hates it! We hates it forever! Then there was silence, but that too seemed menacing to Bilbo. If goblins are so near that he smelt them, then they'll have heard his shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this way will lead you to worse things. The passage was low and roughly made. It was not too difficult for the hobbit, except when, in spite of all care, he stubbed his poor toes again, several times, on nasty jagged stones in the floor. Bit low for goblins, at least for the big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the oars of the mountain, go along at a great speed, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down, but at last the slope stopped. The passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there, at the bottom of a short incline, he saw, filtering around another corner, a glimpse of light. Not red light as of fire or lantern, but a pale out-of-door sort of light. Then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly into an open space, where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine in through a doorway, where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins. Goblins in full armor with drawn swords sitting just inside the door, and watching him with wide eyes, and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident, or a last trick of the ring before it took on a new master, it was not on his fingers. On his finger. With yells of delight the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo. Forgetting even to draw his sword, he stuck his hands into his pockets, and there was the ring still in his left pocket, and it slipped on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delightedly. "Where is he?" they cried. "Go back up the passage," some shouted. Sorry. "This way," some yelled. "That way," others yelled. "Look out for the door," bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armor clashed, swords rattled, goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry, to-do, and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had the sense to understand what was happening, and to sneak behind a big barrel which held drink for the goblin guards, and so get out of the way and avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by feel. "I must get to the door! I must get to the door!" he kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. Then it was like a horrible game of blind man's buff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he had bumped into, scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up, and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he couldn't move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had got wedged on the edge of the door and the door post. He could see outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down into the narrow valley between tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly, one of the goblins shouted, "There is a shadow by the door! Someone is outside!" Ugh, I can't even do my normal orc voice. Gollum just ruined me. Anyways. Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through, with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, while bewildered goblins were still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course they soon came down after him, hooting and hallooing, hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadows of the trees, running quick and quiet, and keeping out of the sun. So soon they went back grumbling and cursing to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped. Oh my word. That was as arduous for me as it was for Bilbo. But I tell you what, I'm going to take a quick break and hopefully rest my vocal cords. I don't think that's possible. I think I'm going to be sounding like this for the rest of my life. But we're going to try. Stay tuned. And we're back. Or I am. I don't know about you guys. I'm back. So that was Riddles in the Dark. It's pretty good, but my voice still hurts. Anyways, looks like Hannah's on the stream. Thanks for coming out, Hannah. Always nice to have some people I recognize on the stream. I also kind of like that Tolkien mentions that the what was it, chestnuts? He said that that one's the obvious one. Well, I don't know. It wasn't really obvious for me. Then again, I'm not very good at riddles in general, so. But definitely The Hobbit is a much easier to understand than most of the Lord of the Rings. I'm glad you've been here the whole time, Hannah. You could have introduced yourself, because I had no idea like when you came in. But yeah, thanks for coming. I didn't know who else was on here. Not that it matters that much, of course, but that's something you don't really see. It's okay, I'm shy too, Hannah. Something like Riddles in the Dark. It's a battle of wits, you know. You don't see that a whole lot in fantasy. I mean, there's plenty of sword fights, but there's not a whole lot of riddles in the dark, which is a shame because it's a great little exchange. It's a very human, you know. It's got almost a strangely warm and fuzzy feeling to it. Just to have a story that's I don't know. I love that little bit about how like no most creatures um are obedient to um the contest of riddles. They find it sacred. Like that's just a thing people have to accept. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, my voice is toast right now, but that's okay. That was a lot of fun. And that's one thing also that separates Tolkien from other fantasy authors is not just his lore, but his sense of I don't know, his sense of worldliness, which might, depending on the context, might not sound like a good thing, but in a lot of stories, especially fantasy, it's just like oh, you know, this guy was so cool, and he's got swords for arms and all this stuff, and Tolkien's idea of a hero isn't this big muscular dude. It's just this hobbit that goes on a simple journey. Well, not a simple journey, but goes on a journey to make the world a better place. This small little creature who, you know, likes smoking his pipe weed and eating bread and coming up with riddles. This very naturalist creature. And you don't see as much of that. A lot of people focus more on everything else. And like some people point out, a lot of people copy Tolkien. They copy the elves and the dwarves and the orcs and whatnot. But they don't copy the hobbits. You don't see a lot of stories that have hobbits in them. And that's a shame. You don't, not even like hobbits themselves, but you know, like equivalent to hobbits. You don't see a lot of that. And that's another thing where, well, maybe not another thing, because that implies I was talking about it earlier when I wasn't. But that is one thing that something like The Legend of Zelda does very well, is that you do have like these kind of these fantasy creatures which are similar to other fantasy creatures, but they're also unique in their own way, and they're more than it's more than just combat. It's more than just a war or how they do in culture. it's also about like how they enjoy themselves and their connection with nature and culture and technology, and that stuff's a lot more complex, so you don't see as much of it. Um, but Riddles in the Dark, that's great stuff. Um, I'm glad I was able to find the whole chapter because that was much better than just reading riddles in general. I'm trying to think. Like I said, I'm not on the ball tonight. So it was a good thing I found that because I'm, not at peak, at a peak performance here. I had thought maybe I would also just in general look up riddles randomly, but you need to be more specific. Otherwise, it's going to be not great. But anyways, I'm trying to think of something else I could do. I suppose I could end the stream a little short, but I would hate to do that if I can help it. There was one time at work where my boss, he's not particularly a what you would call a reader. Not to say he's an idiot, but just that he doesn't read. He's a smart guy. He's bilingual and all that. Pretty cultured. Kind of a douchebag, but he's my boss. But one time, he was just messing around with me. He's like, so if April showers bring May flowers, what do May flowers bring? I was like, pilgrims. And he's like, yeah, that's right. Have you heard that one before? I was like, yeah, in fourth grade. He's like, all right, your turn. Come up with a riddle. And I was like, what? I can't come up with a riddle on the spot. I'm not a hobbit. I don't spend my time reading riddles. And I actually ended up spending like the rest of my workday trying to think of one in case he was persistent about it. He didn't end up asking, but he is an idiot. Well, I mean, no, that's not fair. He's not an idiot. I've met idiots and he's not one. I just don't like him. Anyways. Geez, what else can I do? I hate like trying to. No, don't. I. Okay, here's something I can talk about. This is off topic and not particularly interesting, but I did. Shelby's asking me if I did come up with one. I did. It had something to do with an egg. It was something like I'm white as snow, yet yellow as the sun. I don't remember exactly what I came up with, but egg. For some reason, I just settled on. I was gonna try and get him with egg. Anyways, so I was looking around on uh, Google Play Books because they offered me like I think a $5 credit. And in fact, I got a free copy of The Wind in the Willows from that, which I thought maybe I would read on the stream at some point. No! Oh, no. Jeez. Oh, my voice. My throat. Okay, I thought I had accidentally deleted Wind in the Willows. I didn't, though. Ugh. Ugh. I ruined myself with that stupid Gollum voice. Anyways, so there's a subgenre of fantasy, particularly in Japanese manga. There is this little thing called isekai. I don't know what the exact translation of that is. Maybe I'll look it up real quick. But essentially, isekai, it's really popular these days. Okay, quick look. Isekai is a genre of fantasy anime where a character travels from the world they know to an unfamiliar one. Typically, it's somebody from like a very mundane setting like the real world into fantasy. And for some reason, it's been really popular lately. There's been a lot of it. Let me see. One that's on the rise right now is oh, what the heck is it called? I Got Reincarnated as a Slime. I read a little bit of that, and I actually really liked it. That one was a lot of fun. I stopped reading it though because it does have a lot of fan service, and I think I mentioned on stream that I can't abide that. But anyways, there's a lot of other ones. Inuyasha was another one. Let's see, looking at a quick list of these animes. Trying to think of one that people would recognize. I didn't think about that because Spirited Away is in a league of its own. But Sword Art Online is another one. Anyways, the point is that there's a lot like these where some nerdy guy will be thrown into this fantasy world, and usually what happens is like it's basically wish fulfillment, which happens a lot with fantasy. And so it's also kind of a way like to congeal video games and wish fulfillment at the same time, because you're like, oh, I'm a nerd who likes video games, and I'm an otaku. I'm not gonna do anything with my life. I'm gonna read this manga where this guy is just like me, except all these anime girls come to life and they start touching his wiener. Not that I would know. I haven't read any of those. Anyways, point of this rambling is that there's a lot of these, and I was on Google Play Books just for fun, and I noticed one, which I guess is a parody, or maybe it's fairly straightforward. I couldn't stomach it for more than like a page, but it was reborn as a vending machine. I now wander the dungeon. That is the English translation of this stupid thing. Reborn as a vending machine. And like when you hear a title like that, you gotta find it out. And I guess it's actually more of a novel than a comic, but it's got an anime cover to it. But I just brought that up because I'm trying to kill time. But I did have other things on Google Play that I was kind of curious about, because Google Play, I don't know about other ebook dealers, but Google Play has something kind of unique where like they'll have ebook series, and then usually like the first one will be free, so you can be like, oh, I like this one, and then you can purchase other ones in the series, which is kind of cool. So I think I got this one here, which was like, I really wanted to read it because it has like it just seems so on the nose that I felt like it would somehow be fun. And I haven't started to read it because I don't read as much as I maybe should be. But it's this book called There Will Be Dragons by John Ringo, which is the first in the series. And I think I got this one for free. I'm going to show the cover art real quick. But it was so on the nose that like I had to check it out. I don't remember if I bought it or if it was free because my memory is like that. I think Google Play actually does have comics, yeah. It definitely has yeah, it does actually. There's a whole subgenre for comics. There's like Batman, Deadpool, Rick and Morty, if you're into that. In fact, there's Reincarnated as a Slime right there. Which, for the record, if you're at all interested, I think I Got Reincarnated as a Slime is actually pretty entertaining. Like, I actually like the magic system that they establish, and I don't like magic systems in general. I think they're kind of obnoxious. Because I'm just sitting there and I'm like, why would you even... why would you bother, Because magic shouldn't be explained. Magic is magic, But ultimately, dang it, where am I? if you have to explain it, it's possible to do it right. And I actually kind of liked Reincarnated as a slime. But here is There Will Be Dragons. And like, maybe people don't appreciate this as much as I do, but I love like that pulp fantasy art. There's just something about it that's just amazing. Like just that old school Dungeons and Dragons 70 hair metal. I love that stuff. I don't know what it is. I guess, I mean, I like B movies as well, so maybe I just got a screw loose or something. Um, but I have this, and I was curious about it because it seemed like it was just like it hit all the right notes about what pulp is. Because I've never actually read a pulp novel. I don't think I've read some bad novel, or at least some I didn't like, but uh, I've never actually read a pulp novel, and so I'm kind of curious if it's like actually good or if I'm just going to be like throwing up halfway through the book. I think Hannah's asking me if I read the Ocarina of Time comic. Um, I have a long time ago because I used to, maybe I shouldn't even admit this in public, but I used to, when I was younger, I would read like Zelda fan fiction, and somewhere along that line, I read an online version of that Ocarina of Time comic. I remember that, and even at the time, I thought it was kind of cheesy, but I read it. I read it anyway. I don't know if I ever finished it though. And a few years back at Comic Con, I bought this book, this art book for The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. I'm not crazy about um, I'm not crazy about Link's Awakening. I prefer the 3D games generally in the Zelda series. Um, but I did rather like the art style of it. It's very old school and it's got kind of that pulpy feel to it. Without the nice thing about Zelda is that it is family friendly, so it's not like you've got like with this one, you've got a lady with her tits hanging out, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna go into battle wearing a bikini because that's the sensible thing to do." You don't get that in Zelda, which is nice. And like I said, I don't go in for fan service at all. I just have like no tolerance for it. Pulp notwithstanding, just because like with Pulp, um, Pulp is just so cheesy and stupid. It's like I to me, it's not even like it's not even well within reason. It's not too bad because there are like B movies that are fantasy on Amazon Prime, maybe Netflix as well. I haven't really looked, but I don't even remember what they're called. But these like terrible, terrible fantasy movies that are like basically like porn with all the good parts cut out. And one of them, it was not quite NC-17 or triple X, but it was pretty close there with like this scene. Oh, it was nuts. I don't even know if I want to describe it, but I'm going to because I'm trying to fill up time. So the main story is about these two ladies, these twins, these magic twins, of course, who get captured or they're magically linked to one another. And the first time one of them sleeps with a dude, like the other lady feels it, her sister, like she like and I like just the implication of that is mind-boggling. And I know it's just dumb fantasy schlock, but I was really hoping for just like cheesy fun fantasy, like I don't know, just something stupid that you could watch and enjoy. Because I love fantasy and I love cheesy fantasy, especially. What I don't like though is that a lot of these movies, there was a lot of rape in them, like a lot of rape. It's weird how prevalent it was, and I was just like, okay, I feel like I just wandered onto Reddit or something, and so that's no fun. Which is a shame because there was cool like fantasy stuff in there. Like there was one movie I think even Red Letter Media made fun of it on one of their best of the worst videos. I can't remember what it's called though. It's like I think it starts with like EX, not like Excalibur, but like some sort of magic sword. I bet I could find it if I look for it, but it's not even worth dignifying it by finding out its name. Anyways, uh, there was this scene where like this dude like was wearing like this pig mask, and like it's it's a cheesy B movie, but like just the way it looked, I was like, dang, that's some cool fantasy. Because like when we get introduced to him, he's not like killing someone. He's just in like this feast for like this evil dark lord, and so he's just sitting there like eating with this mask on. And I don't know, just like I can't even really describe it, but I love that. And then like 2 minutes later, he rapes someone. I'm like, okay, okay, that's not fun. Um, my mom just sent a text, so I'm gonna do that, and I'm not going to be telling her what I'm talking about because that would be bad. But anyways, and maybe we could even talk about that. I don't know. I don't know as much about it as maybe I should, or maybe it's not even worth talking about. But there's I have noticed a trend with like genre fiction where there's a lot of scummy people and just like sexual wish fulfillment. And it's one thing if you're like, yeah, and then all these babes totally did me, and like your sword and sorcery thing, like Conan the Barbarian. It's another thing when it's like rape and like a lot of rape and like that's portrayed as like a good thing. Like in that movie I was just talking about, like the opening scene to establish who our hero is, quote unquote, is that he saves this woman from being raped in the woods, and then he just rapes her. Like, granted, she's like submissive, but it's like, okay, this woman just escaped from. This woman just got out of the clutches of life and death, and she's not going to be in the mood. You know what I mean? So it was just like, ugh, it's terrible, and it happens a lot. And like I'm okay with cheesiness. I'm even okay with like bikini armor. I'm not like oh yeah, totally do that. But like if that's the mood of it, I'm okay with it. Um, I'm not okay with like softcore porn, turning a movie into like a skin flick or basically making it a porno in all but name. I can't abide that. And unfortunately, that's way too common in the cheesy subgenre. Um, what do you mean, Hannah? You need friends? You got me, homie. If you want to go, you could go with us. We could talk about it. People in the chat are talking about going to Comic Con. Anyways, I won't dwell too much on like rape in stories. Certainly not tonight, but seriously though, Hannah, like if you buy a ticket or whatever, we're going. It's in April, and you could totally come with us. Anyways, so I like cheesy art and I like all that stuff. Um, uh, cheesy artwork and all that stuff. I like that stuff, but it's kind of tricky because there's a lot of rape in there, which is unfortunate. And we could even talk about like Piers Anthony. I don't want to talk about Marion Zimmer Bradley. She's passed away. She's considered one of the greater fantasy writers out there. I don't want to talk about her because she like what she did was just absolutely awful. Um, um, Marion Zimmer Bradley was she wrote uh, oh, what the heck is it called? Mists of Avalon, which I haven't read, but it's apparently considered like one of the top tier. I'm not going to go into it because A, that's way too much talking, and B, that's like it was beyond messed up, and it just doesn't bear repeating. And then there's Piers Anthony, who, to my knowledge, hasn't technically done anything wrong, at least nothing that would get him arrested. But I've never read any of his books, but Piers Anthony, people claim that he's had like a lot of pedophilic themes in his books. So we could even talk about that, which I know we all do. I know we all want to talk about pedophiles and science fiction. I mean, because who wouldn't? And I won't go into that because there's a lot of there's a lot to go into and a lot of controversy. But there is this weird prevalence of like sexual deviancy and like, I don't know. And yeah, and Tyler's bringing up L. Ron Hubbard, who was a part of like black magic sex cults before he founded Scientology. Yeah, that's fun. L. Ron Hubbard's just like, if he hadn't been so successful, he would have just been a complete joke. But there's plenty of really good stuff on L. Ron Hubbard as well. My Scientology movie's a pretty good look at that. I don't care too much for them. They're a little too edgelord for my taste. But last podcast on the left, I did listen. I did actually listen to the last podcast on the left section on L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. I actually liked that one. I even tried to listen to some of their others, and I just couldn't stomach them. But they have like a 4-part series on Scientology, and that's kind of it is interesting to hear about it. Although, having listened to some of their other stuff, I don't know how well verified some of their stuff is. I won't get too much into that because I don't want to try and think it through when I'm sounding like an idiot myself. But it is at the very least entertaining, and there is stuff about L. Ron Hubbard that I know has been confirmed through other channels, so it's not just all speculation or accusation or what have you. Anyways, I'm trying to think. I guess we could even like, it's such a big topic, and I'm such a prude, I don't know if I would want to, but eventually we could talk about like sexuality in general in fantasy fiction and whatnot. Because a lot of people have accused a lot of other people of being pedophiles and what have you in their stories, and obviously there's a lot of like a rape fantasy or incest fantasy or just weird sexual fantasies in general in their stories. And I guess we could maybe look at some of the controversies of that. I don't want to make this like an edgelord thing like last podcast on the left, so I don't know if I'll do that. It might be worth looking into at some point. Who knows? Piers Anthony is one. L. Ron Hubbard, maybe even George R. Martin, who he went on record saying that like the reason people don't like hobbits is because like they're not as relatable. Because he's like, can you imagine a hobbit having sex? No one can imagine that. And then someone on Tumblr was like, correction, you can't imagine them having sex. I was like, yeah, that's fair. But, yeah, I have officially run out of things to talk about for the night, I think. And my voice is killing me anyway, so I don't think I'm going to drag this out any more than I have to. But I am kind of curious about There Will Be Dragons. I think it's a bit of fun. Or at least I hope. It might give me something to talk about. I'm still working on what is it called? Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I don't always have stuff to talk about. Tonight I was straggling along, and I'm glad that I settled on reading Riddles in the Dark, because that worked out pretty well. And we did talk about last week about religion and how that kind of plays into genre fiction a little bit and philosophy. And it's kind of funny how, because science fiction and fantasy, fantasy especially, is um, dang it, case in point, can't talk, can't think. Um, Fantasy in general has been taken more as like a very minor, uninteresting, or rather just like a not worthy of scholarly examination, debased. I don't know what you would even call it, but like for the longest time, there was this a stigma about fantasy fiction and genre fiction in general, that it just wasn't worthy of scholarly examination, that it was a wasted time, that it was just wish fulfillment and naivete and all this other stuff. And Tolkien was the one who actually changed that stigma and challenged it, not necessarily intentionally. He was just writing something he loved, and it just so happened that what he loved wasn't rape or weird sexual fetishes or just magic, swords and dragons. Tolkien had a lot of heart in his stories, and he was, of course, very devout Christian, so he didn't want to include a lot of really. I don't even know if there's any sexuality in Tolkien's work, at least not that I've heard. I recognize that there's a lot of warfare and there's a lot of bloody conflict and even some moral gray areas, which doesn't always come across in the movies, but it does in the at least in the Silmarillion. Um, and Tolkien was the one who challenged that, and people are like, well, maybe fantasy is worth looking at. And then, of course, there was we kind of talked a little bit about the prominent authors of science fiction. They kind of did the same thing, where Isaac Asimov, I think, well, maybe not Asimov, but there certainly was a little more to consider. And I think I mentioned it last time, but definitely, if I had to recommend one science fiction book, definitely check out Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, which is this short little book about human beings discovering an alien spaceship in our solar system, and it's the first contact. So they board the ship to try and figure out, where it came from and all that stuff. But they only have a certain amount of time. Really good book, really interesting. Even though it's very dry. And I'll say this as somebody that likes genre fiction, looking at a lot of it, and somebody who likes pulp and cheesiness and just silliness. Looking at it, I can understand the stigma that people wouldn't take genre fiction seriously. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, of course, because I mean, fantasy, even before Tolkien came along, fantasy was a prominent genre. And I actually don't know much about fantasy before him. I've seen a lot of his influence after the fact, but anyways, maybe next time we could even talk about Tolkien's letter to the the German publishers. Because talk a little bit more about this maybe next week. But one thing that happened was when the Lord of the Rings was going to be translated into German, I think it was before World War II, but around the time the Third Reich was on the rise. And the German publisher sent him a letter asking him, before they translated, if he had any Jewish ancestry, because they didn't want to. They wanted to make that clear. And Tolkien was so incensed by this that he wrote a very angry letter about it. He just because he was just so against it, so against eugenics and racial discrimination and anti-Semitism. And he was so thoroughly against it. But then he cooled down and he wrote a second letter, which was a lot more calm and professional and what have you. And he gave both letters to his editor, I think, or his publisher. And he said, look, you can choose which of these letters to send. And his publisher's like, well, obviously I'm going to send the professional one. So what ended up happening was they sent the professional one, the calm, collected, polite no. They sent it to them. And then because of the Blitzkrieg, or because of the war. I don't know exactly what happened. That polite letter ended up getting destroyed and lost in the war. But Tolkien's really angry letter, where he goes on about how much they suck and how awful eugenics is, and how uh, uh, culture and heritage is a thing to be proud of, even for the Jewish people. That one letter, which he didn't actually end up getting, which he didn't end up sending, is the only one that survived. So now all we have is like him being angry and yelling at these people for being Nazis. Anyways, I won't read that, and I technically haven't been streaming for 2 hours now, but my voice is killing me. I'm very tired, as usual. Thanks for tuning in on the stream, though. Glad to have Hannah on. Of course, I had my regulars as well: Tyler, Shelby, Kimmery. I think Kagan was on at first. I don't think he's on now because he works tomorrow, like a sap. But anyways, so that's me wringing every last drop out of tonight's session rag. I don't even know what that metaphor means. Or I guess, yeah, that would be a metaphor, not a simile. Anyways, so next time we'll talk about other stuff. But thank you all for coming on the stream. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell me how amazing I am, because I love having my ego stroked. In the meantime, we will be streaming again next week, hopefully. Should be about the same time, 8 p.m. Pacific. But thanks for tuning in. Have a good night.